Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Royal Society. My name is Simon Johnson. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Leadership Council, and on behalf of the Balfour 100 Steering Committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the Balfour Centenary Lecture to be delivered by Professor Simon Schama. Now, there's 300 of us here in the Royal Society this evening, but we're not the only ones watching this lecture. And the reason why it started bang on time is because this event is being live streamed to JW3 in London and to locations in Bournemouth, Brighton, Belfast, Leeds and Glasgow, and all around the internet. So to those of you watching this lecture, wherever you are in the country, a very, very warm welcome. Earlier this year, former Israeli ambassador Daniel Taub visited Waddesdon Manor to chat to Lord Rothschild about how it was that his family came to be involved in the Balfour Declaration and the circumstances that led to this 67-word letter being delivered to his forebear, Walter Rothschild. So let's enjoy their conversation.
So it's possibly the most famous letter in modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words: Dear Lord Rothschild.
Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
Why was it that this letter was sent by the Foreign Secretary to your great-uncle Walter?
It's an interesting question because it was primarily a movement from Eastern Europe, but they didn't clarify who was in charge of that movement. And in addition, it was after all in Great Britain. So they felt that the Rothschild family should be the one to whom it was addressed. And Walter was Lord Rothschild, and he was a Zionist. And those really are the background reasons.
So Walter received the Balfour Declaration, and I have a copy here. And I wonder if I could possibly ask you to read it for us.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I'm going to put on my spectacles to make sure I read it accurately. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur Balfour.
And here it is, the Balfour Declaration. What do you feel when you see it here?
I genuinely feel it's one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Jewish people. If you think it took 3,000 years to get to this, and then you say, how did this miracle happen? It's the most incredible piece of opportunism. I mean, if you think you had an impoverished would-be scientist, Chaim Weizmann, who somehow gets to England, meets a few people, including members of my family, seduces them. He has such great charm and conviction. He gets to Balfour, and he unbelievably persuades Balfour and Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, and most of the ministers, that this idea of the national home for Jews should be allowed to take place. I mean, it's so unlikely. And then he starts to fight a difficult battle with the British cabinet, and this letter goes through 5 drafts, as you know. And in the end, it comes out as a rather compromising letter. I mean, the essential point is there for the Jewish community to fasten on to. You have the first bit, which promises a national home rather than the national home, and then you have the bit that nothing that's to be done should in any way harm the Arab community. But you come back to the big point, which is that this is perhaps the greatest event in Jewish life for thousands of years. And it's a miracle that it took place.
Just tell us a little bit more about Walter, the second Lord Rothschild, because he was an unusual and colourful character.
He was a deeply eccentric man, but from a very early age his passion was collecting.
His niece Miriam writes that for 2 years, as one of his eccentricities, he didn't open any of the letters that were sent to him and stuffed them away into wicker baskets. And it does make you wonder what would have happened if the Balfour Declaration, the letter, had been one of those letters that he'd actually,
Yes,
stuffed.
That's true. At that stage, and it's very difficult to quite understand why, he had taken a deep interest in what was happening about the possibility of Balfour Declaration. So maybe those letters would have got to the top of his pile.
So this is your cousin Dorothy, Dolly.
Yep, Mrs. James de Rothschild.
Can you say a little bit about
Well,
her?
she married my cousin Jimmy when she was 17.
She was a major supporter of Israel, wasn't she?
Major supporter. I mean, she worshipped her husband, who'd been deeply committed, son of Baron Edmore. It was due to him, I think, that she became interested. But once she became interested, she became passionately interested. After his death, she became even more committed. She just wanted to carry out his wishes and what he cared deeply about. And then she had her own personality, a deeply good human being who was quite unselfish. She devoted herself to this place, to Israel, and to a few friends, and had a wonderful life. And you can read letters from her to Weizmann and from Weizmann to her when she was only 17. And what she did, which was crucially important, was to connect up Weizmann with the British establishment.
I think she also trained him in how to deal. She helped educate how to
and it's
conduct
extraordinary
himself.
at that age, but she did sort of tell Weizmann, how to kind of integrate, how to insert himself into British establishment life, which he learned very quickly.
And we're sitting here at the 100th anniversary of this significant letter. If I can just ask you to think about the next centennial, 100 years' time, and just maybe share some of your hopes, your aspirations about where Israel will be.
What does one hope for? One, of course, hopes for a peaceful relationship with Israel's neighbours, and that's going to be the most difficult matter of all to achieve. But even now you can see, with the disarray in the Middle East and the importance of relationships that Israel is developing, not only with Jordan, but also with Egypt and indeed with Saudi Arabia, even if they're not publicised because of the Sunni-Shiite war, there's hope. And I think if you take the need of Arab nations to have intelligence help, and if on the other hand you take compassion and generosity coming from Israel to Palestinian territories and its less fortunate neighbours, there are grounds for optimism, and I am an optimist.
Lord Rothschild, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Balfour 100, please welcome Lord Rothschild.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to introduce Simon Schama tonight. I think we all know he's probably as brilliant and versatile a historian as anyone alive today. And tonight's gathering underlines how thrilled and delighted we are that he should be giving this talk at the Royal Society to mark the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration tomorrow. Simon, as you know, but not everyone in this audience knows, our relationship in a sense goes back 40 years or so. For my father asked you if you would write a book, Two Rothschilds in the Land of Israel. Was it your first book or your second book? Second book. It tells the story of Baron Edmond de Rothschild and his son James's profound interest and involvement with Palestine and then the State of Israel. And he helped persecuted Russian Jews at the time of the Russian pogroms in the 1880s to settle in Palestine. James continued his work and lived in England following the horror of the Dreyfus case in Paris and his marriage to an English girl of 17, as you were hearing earlier at the time, my late cousin Dorothy. Both of them played a prominent role in the events leading up to the Declaration. Towards the end of his life, my cousin James, Jimmy as he was known, donated the Knesset to the State of Israel, and his wife Dorothy, we called her Dolly, continued his work through the foundation Yad Hanadiv, in Hebrew, the benefactor, and it was her idea for our foundation to support the building of the Supreme Court. She entrusted me with the chairmanship of the foundation, which today employs some 40 people in Jerusalem and supports a wide range of activities, including education, technology, environmental issues, and facilitating employment for Arab communities. We're currently engaged in the building of Israel's new National Library in Jerusalem for the people of the book and all faiths. And for the first time, thanks to the technological revolution we're going through, the library will be able to link up its vast and rich collections to peoples of all nationalities and denominations throughout the world. The new building should open its doors to the public in its newly created form on a wonderful island site looking towards the Knesset and the Israel Museum in about 4 years' time. Can I add a few words to the ones you heard earlier about why the Balfour Declaration was addressed to the second Lord Rothschild? His father was the first Lord Rothschild, and he was the first Jew to be admitted to the House of Lords. And through his contacts, he opened the gates of Whitehall for Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, and whose book, The Jewish State, as many of you will know, was published in 1896. His eldest son, Walter Rothschild, was a deeply eccentric individual, and his passion was to create the finest private collection of natural history specimens ever made by one man at his museum in Tring. Then one day, very surprisingly, through his Hungarian sister-in-law, Rosika, who was married to my grandfather, he met Chaim Weizmann, who converted him to Zionism. And he was soon seen as the lay leader of the Jewish community, which was why the Declaration was addressed to him. Our family has therefore been involved with Palestine and Israel for nearly 150 years. And tonight, in the row there are 3 of our children and 3 grandchildren, so there's a good chance, my hope, that we will remain committed for another 150 years and beyond. Now, to go back to Simon, your background makes you ideally suited to talk with feeling about tonight's subject. Your mother, I think, came from Lithuania. Your father, Arthur, was from Smyrna. He's therefore seeped in the background which led to the Declaration. And many of us here tonight will have read your books and seen your recent television documentaries, including the wonderful series on the story of the Jews in 5 parts. Volume 2 has just been published. You've been kind enough to give me a copy tonight. It's had rapturous reviews, and I guess most people in this room will become avid readers. Simon, thank you very much indeed for doing this. We're hugely looking forward to hearing you talk about the Declaration. We did our stint at Cliveden the other day, where you were absolutely brilliant. Let me end these very brief remarks with, I think appropriately, Churchill's words when he visited Mount Scopus in 1921, or 22, I think it was 21. He said, "I believe that the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine will be a blessing to the whole of the world, a blessing to the Jewish race scattered all over the world, and a blessing to Great Britain." I believe he was right. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lord Rothschild. And it's, of course, an extraordinary honour to be doing this. And also because of all these Jews in front of me, terrifying as well. Moments like this, I can, it reminds me of the ultimate and shortest Jewish joke, which a lot of you will know, but you will laugh anyway, of two waiters who go over to the same two elderly Jewish ladies who've been eating the same Lokshen soup and klops for the last 50 years and leans over delicately and says, "Is anything all right?" And sums up all of Jewish history, really. You may feel the same way about an hour from now. My father was 16 years old, just too shy of being conscripted for the trenches, when he and the rest of Whitechapel heard about the Balfour Declaration. The letter sent by the Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to Walter, Lord Rothschild, as you've heard, expressed the British government's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, but added the proviso, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The initial response of Chaim Weizmann, when Sir Mark Sykes came bounding out of the Cabinet Office on November the 2nd, holding the document, announcing, "It's a boy," was disappointment. "Well, at first I did not like that boy," he wrote in his memoir, Trial and Error. "It was not what I had expected." What Weizmann had wanted was the word establishment. This had gone back and forth in the 5 drafts that Lord Rothschild just spoke of, altered to re-establishment, by which, as he wrote, the historical connection to the ancient tradition would be indicated and the whole matter put in its true light. That true light was meant to shine on something nobler than an opportunistic transaction of imperial strategy. Weizmann's own misgivings quickly gave way to euphoria when what had been done, extraordinary thing that had been done, sunk in. That evening, he and his colleagues, Nachum Sokolow, sang what were described as Hasidic songs and danced in celebration. A week later, when the document was made public by the Zionist Federation, my father saw the same singing and dancing erupt in the streets of the East End from Mile End to Whitechapel. Something propitious, something providential had happened, and something very much against the odds. At the time of the declaration, there were probably only about 5,000 members of the Zionist Federation, we're a much healthier place now, across the whole country. And the organization's offices were around the corner in a few small rooms in Piccadilly. But equally, there's no doubt that emotional support was very much broader. If British Zionism did not make the declaration, not unaided anyway, there's no doubt at all that the declaration made British Zionism. A place the Jews could finally call their own swam into excited vision, and not a colony in East Africa, but the birthplace they had never relinquished in memory, ritual, and language. That East End street party, a kosher knees-up, my father called it, lots of fried fish, cake, and shouting, was all instinct and very little thought, but then sometimes instinct is the real story. Arthur, my dad, remembered the Hatikva being sung outside the Fieldgate Street Synagogue, very close to the family home. Composed by the poet Naftali Imber in 1878, before it was set to music a decade later by Samuel Cohen, sounding suspiciously, as it still does, like Bedrich Smetana's Ma Vlast. That was pointed out to Samuel Cohen, by which He said, of course it does. We both use the same Moravian folk song. Very good retort. It's like that wonderful moment where someone pointed out to Brahms that a movement, I think is it the last movement of the First Symphony, sounded suspiciously like Beethoven's Ninth, and Brahms says, well, any idiot can hear that, wonderful retort. A month later, on December the 2nd, the Hatikva brought the crowd to their feet at the celebration in the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. My dad, the teenager, stood outside amidst a huge throng next to sacks of the next day's cabbages. He knew all about the Jewish opposition, anti-Zionists, the grandees of the Anglo-Jewish Association and the Conjoint Committee, Claude Montefiore, and those, it has to be said, alas, those Rothschilds on the wrong side of history, Leopold in particular. He was especially horrified by the public accusation coming from Edwin Montagu, one of the two Jewish members of the cabinet, the other was the pro-Zionist Herbert Samuel, that the Balfour Declaration was tantamount, it's incredible to think this was said, this is what Edwin Montagu did say, was tantamount to being an anti-Semitic document, since in Montagu's eyes it presupposed divided loyalties, especially heinous during the war. Others among the anti-Zionist lobby felt the same way, especially the essayist and distinguished historian, very good historian actually, Lucian Wolff, who had actually been questioned about his true nationality by a policeman in 1915 and never quite got over it. For my father, the defensiveness of the anti-Zionists was a symptom of the gulf dividing West End Jews from East End Jews. Those 67 words he thought could be boiled down to one: buy it, home. And it was all very well for the likes of Edwin Montagu to complain that their indivisible sense of a British home was now vulnerable to charges of divided allegiance. But Montagu's home was manorial. Avenues of oak and elm, game birds flushed from the bracken, dropping to home counties' guns. For my father, who had shul on Shabbos and Shakespeare on Sundays, it was perfectly possible to be indivisibly British and Jewish, British and Zionist. In fact, his whole life and that of all his friends were built around that unproblematic possibility. The meeting of minds, as he assumed there had been, he was right, between Arthur Balfour and Chaim Weizmann, between the philosophical patrician politician and the little Yid from Mottol, as Weizmann liked to describe himself, was not only possible, but somehow and through whatever wayward roots and historically predestined fit. Britain was, after all, a country in which a Jew, thinly disguised as a churchgoer, whose very name effaced his baptism, had been twice prime minister, the towering figure, Israeli, of course, of Victorian conservatism. Everything turned, as it still does, on that one emotively loaded word, home, both for celebrants and mourners. For Jews, it was as if the doors of the ancestral home where Hebrew and Judaism had been created had been thrown open after being barred and locked, most recently locked in the 1880s when the Turkish government put severe restrictions on immigration. But for many Palestinian Arabs, the establishment of a Jewish national home seemed even then an early notice of eviction. Whether or not that pessimism was justified at the time, or whether it became a tragically self-fulfilling prophecy, is still being fiercely argued. But in the midst of our celebrations, we owe it to the moral case for the Declaration to put ourselves sometimes in Palestinian shoes as well as our own. To do that did not, after all, make Achad Ha'am or Martin Buber less Zionist. Perhaps it made them more. Home, the national home, meaning a place where the Jews could at last control their destiny. Or as Leon Pinsker, the Odessa author of Auto-Emancipation, had put it in 1882 in response to the brutal wave of pogroms following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, home would be, Pinsker's beautiful, poignant words, a small plot of earth where we can live as human beings. At that point, while Pinsker argued the salvation of the Jews lay in recognizing immediately that they constituted a nation, not just a religion, he did not actually argue for Palestine. In fact, he argued against it for being too tied up with anachronistic messianic expectations, which he thought would paralyze rather than catalyze political mobilization. For Pinsker, though, this is the crucial point. If any of you have not read Auto-Emancipation, you owe it to yourself to do that, as well as Moses Hess's Rome and Jerusalem. For Pinsker, perpetual homelessness was perpetual powerlessness. And what that helpless condition habitually provoked was contempt for the eternal vagrant, suspicion of the rootless cosmopolitan whose wandering, according to Christian medieval legend, had been a result of an ancient curse. Worst of all for Pinsker was the response of the ostensibly benevolent towards that condition of homelessness: pity. Pity precluded anything like true equality of rights. It guaranteed yet another round of traumatic expulsion, whole populations pitchforked down that endless road along which we homeless were doomed to trudge. Odessa, his hometown, the ultimate anti-shtetl, ought to have been a place where secular, educated, Russian-speaking modern Jews, the lawyers, the writers, the stevedores, the cabaret singers, should have found a secure, normalized domicile. But it was precisely that acculturation, the indistinguishability of Jews from everyone else, which, just as in Moses Hess's Germany, Dreyfus's France, and Herzl's Vienna, bred the new strain of anti-Semitism. The suspicion that the city suits and the smart journalism were just a front for the eternal conspiracies of the global Jews, whose only true loyalty was to each other and whose only true country was the synagogue, overt or covert. From that hideous modern paranoia had come the protocols of the Elders of Zion, forged by the Russian secret police and published in 1903, copies of which were to be found in the haversacks of officers in Russian armies, those of the Tsars, those of the Whites, and those of the Reds, along with widespread, ineradicable belief in the blood libel that the baking of Passover matzah required the blood of murdered Christians, preferably children. There was no sign, as Dr. Pinsker knew, and all Zionists assumed, that these unspeakable demonizations were going away anytime soon with modernity's heralded exorcism of unreason. Quite the contrary seemed to be the case. The last blood libel trial, that of Menachem Beilis in Kiev, had taken place as recently as 1913. And although he was acquitted, the verdict was, of course, held in anti-Semitic court circles, including Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, who was to be commander-in-chief of the Russian Imperial Army in the First World War, to be a fix organized by the sinister conspiratorial hand and ubiquitous money of international Jewry. From France to Russia, the Jews were in a lose-lose bind. The attack on their obstinate separation from host societies had never really abated. So it was said they were always being separated, but now the least separated were equally attacked for the subterfuge of assimilation. Alfred Dreyfus had been falsely incriminated as a spy and a traitor precisely because of his presumptuous display of conscientious patriotism. In Britain, anti-Semitic journalists like Leopold Maxer pumped up hatred at the immigrants who'd come to the island cities as a refuge from pogroms, and the more cultivated class of anti-Semites like G.K. Chesterton and John Buchan, whose 39 Steps was a thinly veiled version of the sinister Jewish conspiracy, had no trouble finding space for their witty malice. The Aliens Act of 1905 had been passed in response to an explicitly anti-Jewish campaign mobilized by the British Brothers League. In June 1917, there were anti-Semitic riots in Leeds and Bethnal Green. When in Eastern Europe, Jewish radicals hoped for a new homeland of workers in which their rights would be respected along with others, they found, as one of them put it, their overtures were greeted with crowbars. Worse was to follow in the Soviet era. So Jews could be forgiven for thinking there was no safe position for them to take, and in extremis, nowhere for them to go. Jews have not been the only people in the world to have suffered uprooting, but they have been the only people in the world eternally unable to find a place where shelter would not be given on sufferance, conditionally, provisionally, liable always to be withdrawn, terminated along with many lives at short notice. This was becoming as true in the Islamic world as the Christian. There were horrifying massacres and mass rapes in Jerba, Jewish population on the island, in Tunisia on Yom Kippur in 1864, a wave of blood libel accusations in Morocco between 1873 and 1877. In Yemen, intense persecution was becoming the norm, endemic, really. Jewish attachment to the Francophone modernizing ethos in the Maghreb was going to make that worse. Hence, everywhere except perhaps in the United States and the Netherlands, the urgency, the moral imperative. No one in countries inheriting a legacy of expulsion and doors shut against the desperate, as they were in Britain after the Aliens Act, as they were in the United States after 1921, is in any kind of strong position to question Zionism's legitimacy. The mass punishment of innocence, which would reach its cataclysm in the Shoah, was already taking place on an epic scale precisely at the time of Zionism's campaign that culminated in the Balfour Declaration. If the Second World War is instrumental in understanding how the State of Israel came into being through the agency of the United Nations, the First World War is the necessary context of the Declaration. Unfolding on the Eastern Front, a theatre every bit as savage as the Western Front, was a convulsion of uprooting and violence against the Jews, the like of which had never before been experienced, even in the worst excesses of the pogroms of the 1880s and 1903 to 1907. Precisely because the East End, with its influx of Jews from the Pale, was closer to that trauma. My mother had members of her family in near Kovno still. Many of them were still trapped in this maelstrom. The relationship between the latest round of enforced homelessness and the vision of a Jewish home was intensely immediate. Consider the scale of the disaster. Between the start of the war in 1917, at least 600,000 Jews, caught between the shifting troop movements of the Austro-Hungarian and German armies on the one side and the Russians on the other, were deported from their homes further back into the interior of Russia. This had the effect of breaking up the old Pale of settlement, but the mass uprooting was chaotic and accompanied by thousands of separate pogroms, especially murderous when the Russian army was retreating, with the most terrifying havoc taking place in eastern Galicia, in southern Ukraine. Estimates of the civilian dead range from 50,000, the most conservative figure, to as high as 200,000. This was the first Holocaust, dear friends. The Russian Revolution brought no respite. The opposite, in fact. 100 Jews burned alive in Fastov, 250 slaughtered at Rusava near Boguslav, and on and on and on. The civil war, which followed, saw 1,300 separate pogroms, mostly perpetrated by the whites, the anti-Bolshevik volunteers, and the Poles. 106, though, by units of the Red Army, in particular by Budenyi's 1st Cavalry. When Red Army officers tried to stop them, for they decently did, they were either stabbed or shot when they tried to do so. When Jewish fatalities from the two back-to-back wars are put together, they could come to 500,000, with many more wounded, and 250,000 Jewish children orphaned. The most vividly eloquent witness to this immense catastrophe was the writer S. Ansky, best known as the author of the startling, beautiful, perennially produced Yiddish drama, The Dibuk. Ansky was born Shloime Zanvel Rappaport in that cradle of cultural ferment, Vitebsk. But when he broke free of the world of the cheder and the shul, he changed his name to the made-up Ansky, after his mother Anna. Shifting from Yiddish to Russian, Ansky became literary editor of the journal Evreysky Mir. When he was hounded by the Tsarist police for subversive politics, he moved to Paris, where he was secretary to the leader of the Social Revolutionary Party. Really, Ansky was one of its founders. The brutality of the pogroms from 1903 to 7, particularly Kishinev, of course, brought him back to the Jews and to Yiddish. In 1912 and 1914, he took a Jewish ethnographic expedition to Galicia to record shtetl lives on camera and on cylinder recordings. If you ever find yourself in St. Petersburg, the Ethnographic Anthropological Museum has those cylinders. They're absolutely wonderful. The result is one of the great archives of Jewish life. When Ansky came back in 1915, he saw that same society in ruins. Whole towns like Plonia and Brody in blackened, scorched devastation. Nothing left of Jewish districts, their occupants either murdered, wounded, or fled in terror to cities like Warsaw, where they arrive with rags on their backs, destitute, starving, and of course, homeless. He saw the burnt-out remains of Jewish houses, Sefer Torah scrolls, defiled, torn to bits, thrown in mud puddles, to be sniffed at by stray dogs. He heard terrible stories of elaborate cruelty, perpetrated by Russian troops, especially Cossacks, mothers raped, killed in front of their own small children. In Brostek, he heard of a father and son taken out to be summarily hanged. The son was told his life would be spared if he personally hanged his father. He refused, but the father begged him, and unhinged with distress, the son went through with it while the soldiers sat around and laughed before stringing up the son anyway. Ansky, moreover, saw these hideous enormities were not just the result of disintegrating order in the country between lines of the Eastern Front. Other populations, ethnic Germans in particular, were also subject to deportation. But the worst, most gratuitously sadistic horrors were selectively perpetrated on defenseless Jews because of the tenacious grip of the most paranoid strains of anti-Semitism, intensified during wartime. The usual suspicions attached to rootless Jews, especially when it had been the Russian state which had confined them to particular territories and towns, morphed into full-on accusations of espionage and treason. Yiddish was held to be synonymous with German, which then turned every Yiddish speaker into a potential or actual spy. The Jews were said to possess secret telephones, a whole network, in fact, through which they were supposed to communicate Russian troop movements to the enemy. The Jews, it was well known, hoarded gold bars and sent them across lines to the Austrians. A whole mythology of treason circulated through the war zone, shared not just among the ranks and the local country people, but as Ansky discovered, by the officer corps, even right up to some of the command itself. Everyone knew and believed stories of Jewish girl snipers shooting at soldiers from the windows of bombed-out houses, allegations which triggered another round of mass rapes and punitive executions in the places where it was said to have happened. So for Ansky and for so many others, being Jewish meant sooner or later being a homeless, stateless refugee, or worse. This fate could befall even professionals and commercial Jews who'd been permitted to reside beyond the Pale in Moscow in 1891. Much of that population was summarily expelled. Did this belated insight make Ansky a Zionist? Not exactly, or not immediately. He became one before he died. Caught up in revolutionary optimism, he clung for a while to the socialism of his Paris years, was elected a social revolutionary deputy to the Constituent Assembly in 1917. The hope, of course, was that the dawn of workers' and peasants' solidarity that was supposed to emerge from the revolution would finally emancipate the Jews from anti-Semitic persecution. But before he died in 1920, he'd witnessed the worst of the next wave of horrors visited on the Jewish communities of Russia. It may have been precisely the Bolshevik dictatorship's demonization of Zionism, its outlawing of Hebrew, which may have led him to close ranks with those among whom he counted his Zionist friends. Did information about the magnitude of that human calamity taking place in Eastern Europe make British politicians more receptive to the Zionist message. Not at first among those holding office in the war government, certainly not much earlier in the war, the genteelly anti-Semitic Prime Minister Asquith, before Lloyd George, it's a different matter. Because at that point, after all, Tsarist Russia was still an ally in the death struggle with the Central Powers. If anything, the cabinet closed its ears to the troubling news. But there was a wider sense in which the great and the good among the British political establishment, including at least one broadsheet editor, C.P. Scott of the Manchester Guardian, accepted, who became a great friend of Weizmann's, of course, accepted the inescapably dark truth that life for the vast majority of Jewish millions in Eastern and Central Europe was doomed to be an endless ordeal, constantly held hostage to blood libel nightmares, pogrom violence, as well as the organized political anti-Semitism in German states. However successful emancipation had been in Western Europe, however advanced the process of integration of Jews into the world of liberal Europe, in the East, where most Jews were concentrated, that process could always be thrown into reverse. It had been the case in Russia when Alexander III succeeded to the throne of his assassinated father. There, the nightmare never went away. If anything, the reverse, as blood libel cases in Hungary and pogroms in Romania had shown. An inescapable conclusion was that it would become even worse as militant nationalism tried to shake itself loose from the ancient multinational empires. The first enemy modern nationalism turned on were those so-called permanent cosmopolitans, seen as German-speaking rather than Czech or Ukrainian or Hungarian or Romanian, pawns of and collaborators with the oppressive empires. The charismatic populist leader of Polish nationalism, Roman Dmowski, was also the most adamant, violent anti-Semite. So that one of the foundational premises really, of Zionism, that modernity, especially when it took the form of nationalist passion, would make life worse rather than better for the Jews, seemed to be coming true fast. In Britain, there was a different and much less sinister sentiment predisposing some figures in the governing elite towards Zionism: Christian restorationism. This was the undisguised evangelical belief going back centuries that the ingathering of the Jews to the Holy Land and the eventual rebuilding of the temple was the precondition of their mass conversion, which in turn would hasten the second coming of Christ and the onset of the last days. Missionary zeal often went hand in hand with Anglo-American biblical archaeology, the determination to pinpoint particular sites of scriptural significance. The true Mount Sinai, quite hard to nail, as you probably know, the walls of Jericho, and of course biblical Jerusalem. The more the Hebrew Bible came alive through these expeditions, documented in illustrated books and then in photographic exhibitions, the more an ancient Judea with its farmers, warriors and scribes seemed to be begging for a reawakening. Such a renaissance, the restorationist believes, would work also an unimaginable economic and social transformation, not just in Palestine, but in the whole region. Only the most benighted anti-Semite denied the exceptional value Jews placed on education whenever given the chance. The leaps and bounds by which Jews had flocked into science and the professions, making distinctive contributions to the advance of knowledge, was legendary. This transformational vote of confidence had been a strain of economic philo-Semitism going all the way back to the Irish deist John Toland, who in 1714, in his Reasons for Naturalizing the Jews, had argued for mass Jewish settlement in his country, in Ireland, because the Irish problem would be solved by the Jews, to which one can only think, oy vey, or oh vey, you know. But who also, at the end of his tract, applied the same reasoning for the case for a recreation of Jewish Palestine. It's an amazing thing. It actually explodes in the pages of that extraordinary and very little known, extremely interesting book that Toland wrote. Conversionary ardor and economic prophecy kept company with a more purely, richly romantic strain of philo-Semitism, which at some point in the 19th century turned Zionist, even Christian Zionist. Even before the Viennese student Natan Birnbaum, one of the founders of the Jewish student club Kadima, coined the term in 1890. It was he who coined the term Zionism. Very often this reawakening was cast by gentle too, Philo-Semites as an ethical reproach to the blight of materialism, a nice inversion of stereotypes, especially that one made popular by Karl Marx. A reproach also to the vulgar blandishments of fashionable society. Out of that chrysalis of hollow social conformity would emerge somehow the rediscovered Jew, philosophically elevated, morally noble, eyes turned toward Jerusalem. The great text of this redemption parable was, of course, George Eliot's Daniel Deronda. But there were many other influential believers in late 19th century Britain who, rather than recovering their own Jewish identity, because most of them had none, appointed themselves heralds and harbingers of a specifically moral Jewish reawakening in Palestine. The most self-consciously visionary was Lawrence Oliphant, who had begun adult life as an official of the empire, continued as MP for Stirling, but then became a communitarian believer in the redemption of agricultural labor, kind of proto-kibbutznik. He took that bundle of not altogether coherent beliefs to Haifa, where in the late 1870s and 1880s he bought thousands of acres with the idea of creating a new kind of Jewish life in an ancestral country. Oliphant believed this would be the answer to Romanian and Russian persecution, but he also believed, this is very important, in an organic, unbroken, historical connection of Jews to the land of Israel. Some of the most powerful passages in his rather beautiful book, published in 1882, are when he discovers near the shore of Lake Tiberias at Kfar Nahum at Capernaum the ruins of what had been thought to be a Roman temple, but Hebrew inscriptions and emblems made visible were clearly the remains of a synagogue. Likewise, in the village of Pekin, he was convinced that Jews, who were the majority of the hamlet, were descendants of those who, through the millennia, had actually never left. In one memorable scene, he gathered Jews and Arab fellahin cultivators together to inaugurate a new agricultural colony. In contrast to what the common practice had been, the Arab tenants were not to be ejected, but worked together with Jewish pioneers to reclaim the land. For Oliphant, although Jews at that time constituted only an eighth of the population of Palestine, the towns where they were concentrated, 4,000 in Safat, 7,000 in Tiberias, 50,000 in Jerusalem, it was going up where they'd been the majority for many decades, were the authentic mark of a tenaciously unbroken Jewish presence. Which is all very well, I know, but dry-eyed historical analysis would insist that when it came to the actual formulation of the Balfour Declaration, all this was so much romantic vapor besides the imperatives of imperial strategy in the midst of the Great War. In an especially terrible year, 17, with the double disasters of Gallipoli and the Somme the previous year behind it, Britain needed a breakthrough. Chaim Weizmann encouraged the belief that in two places where it mattered, Russia and the United States, Jewish influence could make a difference, in the latter case by promoting America's joining the Allies. And in fact, Balfour went to see Woodrow Wilson, and the key intermediary, very important thing, was Louis Brandeis. And Balfour could easily fall for a powerfully eloquent and brilliant Jew. He fell for Brandeis almost as hard as he'd fallen for Weizmann. In the Middle East itself, the simultaneous encouragement of both an Arab revolt against the Turks, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons Faisal and Abdullah, and a Jewish home for Palestine, could tip the scale for the Allies. And all these considerations came together in one extraordinary personality, the man who, until Professor Rubinstein made his role clear, had gone almost unnoticed, the conservative politician Leo Amery. He was not so much a Jew awaiting self-discovery as one who had discovered his mother, though baptized, was originally a Hungarian Jew. Amery was also a protege of the imperialist Alfred Milner and a friend of Simon Marx, the founder, of course, of Marks and Spencer's, which in turn connected him to Simon Marx's Manchester comrade Chaim Weizmann. As Rubinstein observes, the secret Jew might have been expected to cover all traces of this embarrassing identity by throwing in his lot with the most aggressive Jewish anti-Zionist, Edwin Montagu, and argue that Zionism might open Jews to charges of divided allegiance. But Amory did nothing of the sort. Instead, from his office as political secretary to the War Cabinet, he turned Herbert Samuel's 1915 Palestine Memorandum and the English Zionist Federation's drafts for a national home in Palestine into a document that would command a majority in the cabinet over the fiercest, and they were very fierce, objections of Montagu. The letter to Lord Rothschild was signed by Arthur Balfour, but its editor was, who certainly had, as he put it, a finger in the pie, was Leo Amory. Even that wasn't enough for Amory, as he went on to propose with Zeev Jabotinsky the creation of a Jewish legion. It was Amory's idea, actually, not Jabotinsky's. Jabotinsky was very happy to welcome it, to serve against the Turks, which in its 3 battalions was the first Jewish military force to be formed since the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome in 135 CE. Now, none of this is to discount for a moment the decisive role played by Weizmann himself in persuading the British government that supporting a Jewish national home in Palestine was somehow both strategically and imperially useful and historically a good deed. Weizmann even thought Lloyd George not completely immune from the latter kind of sentiment. He made much of finding Lloyd George reading out loud from the Psalms when he visited him. But there was no question that the combination of pragmatism and idealism did in fact appeal to the often enigmatic, laconic Balfour, whom Weizmann first met in Manchester during an election campaign in 1906. It helped, I think, that Weizmann had little of the self-consciously charismatic quasi-messianism that Theodor Herzl had projected, and which alienated almost as many as it beguiled. For men who thought of themselves as hard-bitten, down-to-earth liberals like C.P. Scott, Weizmann was Jewish, but not too Jewish. Unmistakably the real thing from Russia, but also a scientist who had an almost Machiavellian grip on the mechanics of negotiation. But then it's all too easy, by way of contrasting Weizmann with assimilated Jews like Herzl and Max Nordau, for whom a Nachtasil, a place of refuge, wherever it was, East Africa, El Arish, Cyprus, Argentina, would do to think of him, Chaim Weizmann, in the way he called himself, as that little Yid from Motel. No, he wasn't. While he had an Orthodox upbringing, his father had a library of secular literature into which Chaim, the young Chaim, plunged. The family business was logging and rafting timber at the more prosperous end of the world of the Pale. Weizmann had gone through a succession of education out from the shtetl via Pinsk, then to Germany, to Switzerland, before ending up in Manchester. Tevye with a chemistry degree, he wasn't. But when he thought it would work, as it did with people whom Herzl had exasperated, like Edmond de Rothschild, Weizmann could turn on the voice of the masses, not least because he was actually listening to that voice, as was Nachum Sokolov, as was Achad Ha'am, because he could translate that voice into practical politics. All the same, as he implied in that response to Mark Sykes, he didn't in the end get quite what he wanted. His objective was not a national home in Palestine, but Palestine as the national home. There was a big glaring difference. The wording as it appeared in the letter implied that the Jewish home would not occupy the totality of Palestine, but just part of it. There was already a dispute about whether the territory of a great Arabian state, with Sharif Hussein as its ruler, outlined in a correspondence with Sir Henry McMahon in 1915, included or excluded Palestine when it spoke of districts west of Damascus and Homs, and that was supposed to be an area not going to be part of this great pan-Arabian imperial state, practically. And the secret Sykes-Picot agreement made public in 1917 by the Russian revolutionary government, dividing the region into French and British protectorates, with most of Palestine actually falling into the French zone, in any case made that moot. It's often said that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a terrible violation of the promises to the Arabs at this time. It was also a complete violation of the promises made to the Zionists as well. So both had our noses put out of joint. But there was no mistaking the presumption that Palestine would somehow end up being shared or divided between Arab and Jewish entities. Only with that crucial reservation was it possible for the British government to persuade itself it could square the circle and satisfy at the same time the apparently irreconcilable goals of both Arab and Jewish national self-determination. The bloody history of successive failed partition plans, in retrospect, makes that hope seem either deluded from the outset or actually disingenuous, with all parties disguising their real positions. Zionism, certainly the case with Jabotinsky, conceding the vague formula of a national home while always aiming for a sovereign Jewish state in the entirety of Palestine, while Arab leaders like Emir Faisal, Sharif Hussein's son, let themselves seem open to Jewish immigration, even while knowing the intensity of local Palestinian hostility to it. As for the British, it was that critical proviso, it being understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities of Palestine. Was that a gesture to ensure that the Arab revolt against Turkey was not derailed? Or did government ministers like Herbert Samuel actually think somehow conflict could be contained? One could very well argue that there was nothing intrinsic actually about the establishment at last of a Jewish national home which would violate civil or religious rights of the Palestinian community. Most of the answers given by historians, shadowed by knowledge of how all this was going to play out in the Mandate, are bleakly pessimistic, if not downright cynical. But at the time, the possibility of two national awakenings coexisting side by side, or at least refraining from mutual annihilation or destruction, was not, in fact, out of the question. And this is contrary to most polemical histories. At least some figures in either camp were paying attention to the other, and not invariably from a stance of intransigent hostility. It's been a commonplace of anti-Zionist history that for the Zionists, the native Palestinian population was disregarded to the point of invisibility. But the notorious epigram, you hear this all the time in anti-Zionist polemics, of a land without people for a people without land, was not uttered by any Zionist leader at all, but a Christian restorationist earlier in the 19th century. While it's certainly true that the size of the Palestinian majority did not alter the Zionist conviction of a return home to the place where the Hebrew language, the scriptures, and Jewish religious and historical identity have been born, it's also true that a number of Zionists not only saw perfectly plainly the presence of a large Palestinian majority, but believed that the prospects of a Jewish national home in a part of Palestine would turn on the relationship between the two communities. The earliest and most emphatic of those commentators was Ahad Ha'am, born Asher Ginsburg, a hero of mine, I have to say, a prolific and brilliant Hebrew essayist who almost alone in 1897 at the First Zionist Congress refused to be seduced by the visionary rhetoric of Herzl's program, and who was actively alienated by Herzl's emphasis on lobbying foreign governments to create as speedily as possible a Jewish state. Returning from the Congress, Ahad Ha'am actually wrote, this is rather shocking, he said he felt like a mourner at the wedding. Such a state, he believed, could be no more than some sort of artificial entity. Its various elements, the Constitution, which Herzl famously wanted to be, as he put it, an aristocratic republic, mechanically borrowed from Gentile history and culture. For Ahad Ha'am, this was to do everything backwards. He was horrified by the idea that Zion could be exported to East Africa or some such place. No, the Eretz Israel had to be grown organically, grounded in the ancestral spirituality of Judaism and the rich singularity of the Hebrew language and the incomparable antiquity and complexity of Jewish history. Part of that irreducibly Jewish character, he insisted, had to be ethical. In 1893, after two visits to Palestine, both of them before the appearance of Herzl's Judenstaat, he published Truth from the Land of Israel, in which nothing and nobody was spared. Much of his criticism was leveled at the dependency of Jewish settlers, I'm sorry to say this, Jacob, on the philanthropy of Baron Edmond de Rothschild. He was wrong, of course, goes without saying. a condition he thought generated either servility or truculence, in either case, not the fortitude of will and spirit that was the sine qua non of the Zionist ambition to remake Jewish life. But he also criticized Jewish settlers for their attitude towards the Palestinian fellahin. And this is an absolutely committed 100% Zionist, describing it sometimes as brutal and arrogant. From 1907, he worked and lived in London as the agent of the Russian Vysotsky Tea Company and became, I think probably Chaim Weizmann, certainly one of his closest friends, if not he lived on Haverstock Hill, and Weizmann, when he came from Manchester, often stayed with Achad Ha'am. So it seems inconceivable to me that Weizmann himself could have shut his eyes and ears to what Achad Ha'am had to say. But I will say this, actually, there are some respects Achad Ha'am is too hard on Herzl, especially too hard on Herzl's admittedly fanciful novel, Alt-Neuland, Old New Land, published in 1902, a romantic vision of what had become of the projected Jewish state 2 generations later. The book actually, although it's no brilliant work of literature, it is fascinating in many respects. It contained the germ, admittedly utopian, of what became an article of faith among all Zionists. And indeed, it was something that Emir Faisal hoped for too. Especially, this was an article of faith for Weizmann, who believed, like John Toland, that a transformation of the land would lift all boats and would benefit Jews and Arabs alike. Hence, Herzl, in his novel, has a stock Palestinian greet with disbelief that Jewish immigration could have been to the disadvantage of the Arab population. Conversely, the villain of the agricultural village in which one chapter is set is one Dr. Geyer, who is a fanatically exclusionist Jew, wants the country for Jews alone, and says so in the kind of language not 100 miles away from the most militant annexationists today of Judea and Samaria, in case you didn't know my political point of view. Achad Ha'am was not alone. During the 7th Zionist Congress at Basel in 1905, the Russian-born teacher, incredibly interesting figure this, Yitzhak Epstein, who was a settler in Rosh Pinah, the earliest agricultural colony in Galilee, gave a courageous lecture published 2 years later in Hashiloach, the Hebrew journal founded by Achad Ha'am, setting out what he called a question which outweighs all others, namely what was going wrong with the relationship between Jews and Palestinian Arabs on the ground. At the local level, the trouble was embedded in the way land was being bought and occupied by Jewish settlers. Purchases were made perfectly legally and almost always from Palestinian landlords, but they were only too eager to sell at artificially inflated prices. The trouble, however, began when local Palestinian tenant farmers, the fellahin, often who had rented generation to generation without a written contract, were dislodged to make way for the new colonies or reduced to casual labor. Epstein had seen this happen himself. He'd heard, as he wrote, the weeping women who had to leave their village and saw them kiss the stones on the ground before they departed. Such spectacles moved Epstein to think of more than one version of what constituted a home in Palestine, Israel. His solution for this problem was Zionists to confine land purchases to uncultivated and unoccupied land, as in fact often did happen, Karen Kiamet, not always, to preclude moments of tragic uprooting. There was another way, too, in which Epstein's intervention parted company with some Zionist assumptions. While trouble of the kind he described happened locally, he argued that Palestinian Arabs had to be treated just as Zionist Jews themselves as a nation he described as great, zealous, and formidable. And that would have to be a premise of any negotiation with a chance of success. Just who would be the representative figures with whom Jews could conduct such a negotiation, in fact conclude what Epstein in a charged term called a Brit, a covenant, was unclear, as it has been ever since. Around the time of the Balfour Declaration, others, often with their own roots in the Middle East, who wrote and spoke Arabic, offered still more optimistic visions of a shared future. In 1919, Chaim Margalit Kalvarisky, who was the land agent of the Jewish Colonization Association and indeed of Pico, the Rothschild successor, had seen for himself the polarization of the two communities and argued before the Zionist Commission in 1918 that Palestine the new Palestine need not be a zero-sum conflict, that a Jewish-Arab understanding need not compromise the central principle of the Jewish national home, and that the two languages, Hebrew and Arabic, should coexist side by side there. This sense of a shared place, a shared country, a shared neighborhood, a shared home has, of course, foundered on the hard reef of history. It was taken up by other Zionists, Artur Rupin, Judah Magnus, the rector of the Hebrew University, and most famously by Gershom Scholem and Martin Buber, most optimistically when they founded Brit Shalom, using that loaded word of Epstein's in 1925. But they were in direct opposition to the confrontational realists like Jabotinsky, who wrote off such pieties, and you can understand him really, as at best the dreams of people hopelessly detached from reality, at worst soft men and women who were betraying what was paramount, the immediate needs of Jewish self-defense against intransigent, violent Palestinian opposition to immigration. That's still the fact of the matter. That particular conflict defined the 1920s is what we're living with still. And you can understand the force of both sides. When Ahad Ha'am argued passionately in 1921 against revenge being taken for the violent Arab murders inflicted on Jewish communities a year earlier, he was very definitely in a small minority, never commanding any serious numbers or supporters, nor really ever breaking out from its heart in the Hebrew University. Brit Shalom collapsed against the desperate need to protect and reinforce Jewish Palestine. What alternative was there in the 1930s and 40s when the gates of shelter for those facing annihilation were slammed shut by the draconian immigration restrictions by the United States and by Great Britain, which in 1939, in response to Palestinian revolt of 3 years earlier, issued the white paper limiting Jewish immigration to just 75,000 over 4 years. That, in effect, was a death sentence for millions of people, and the revocation, as many saw it, of the Balfour Declaration. In 1942, Hannah Arendt put it best, when despite the full extent of the Nazi final solution being known, she said, the world divided into those who want us to leave, want us to be gone, and those who deny us entry. And yet, for a brief, tantalizing moment, there had been an alternative possibility. The year after the declaration, in the broiling heat of June 1918, Weizmann decided to make an arduous journey by boat, camel, and foot to the encampment of Emir Faisal to discuss the possible convergence of Arab and Jewish national movements. Weizmann remembered the moment as elusive magic. He could be a most beautiful writer. It was a brilliant moonlit night, Palestinian moonlight. I looked down from Moab on the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea and the Judean hills beyond. His reverie of time folded in on itself. He was carried along an unbroken river of memory before he was suddenly interrupted by a British sentry's admonition. It crept up behind him. "Sorry, sir, I'm afraid you're out of bounds." Was he? Weizmann and Faisal spoke for 2 hours. And this was Faisal's idea, then posed for a smiling photograph. Out of that meeting came a document prepared by T.E. Lawrence, in which Jewish immigration was welcomed by Faisal as compatible entirely with Arab aspirations. Lawrence, Weizmann claimed, always maintained the complementary nature of the two national movements. But the status and the mutual understanding, especially in the part of the Emir, has long been the subject of dispute, as has a further document resulting from the meeting of the two men at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, mediated partly through Felix Frankfurter. Pessimists on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian argument have said, in any case, this was the briefest of all honeymoons, was moot because of the machinations of the Anglo-French allies who were setting aside the undertakings they'd given the Hashemite leaders of the Arab revolt, as well as the Zionists. Faisal had added a rider to the agreement that should any of the undertakings to him not be fully honoured, even, as he put it by one word, any kind of mutual understanding between the Arabs and the Zionists would be null and void. So that was it. It's also been argued that in any case, any informal treaty made by someone remote from the Palestinian community would never be honoured in Jerusalem, and Jaffa would expose Faisal as a traitor to the Arab cause. Remember, Abdullah, his brother, was chopped for such a presumption. Doubtless it's still of paramount importance that agreement be reached by democratically elected representatives of both sides, but the hunt for such governments in the Arab world remains as elusive as ever, as dynasties and dictatorships are the norm pretty much from the Nile to the Gulf. And yet, dear friends, it seems to me absolutely unequivocally right, with all this surus notwithstanding, to celebrate this centenary unapologetically, but thoughtfully, as the inception of one of the great historical miracles. For all its problems and troubles, for the acts obstinately liberal Zionists like me ardently wish were not enacted, for all the demolitions and terrorist atrocities on the other side that make a shared home further and further out of reach, Israel still stands as a living, breathing, debating, thriving, rejoicing democracy. It's 6 million Jews, the ultimate retort to the number that Adolf Hitler exterminated. The life of Israel is Hitler's failure. But it's also to hope against all the odds that somehow the vision set out by Yitzhak Epstein, or that for which Yitzhak Rabin, no starry-eyed sentimentalist, sacrificed his life to a murderer's gun 22 years ago this coming Shabbat, will not be entirely and forever in vain. I've myself seen small vindications of it. Schools, Yad V'Yad, where the governing body is both Israeli and Palestinian. The extraordinary organization called Eco-Peace, run from Tel Aviv, Amman, and Ramallah, in which the bloodstained narratives of destruction are set aside for the practical common good of dealing with the issues of common environmental concern, above all water crisis, especially the Dead Sea, which is losing a meter a year. For once, that grieving has a common source, the slow perishing of the Jordan River, the life source for all the people of the neighborhood. To speak of such things as fragile shoots of tikva, hope, can and will, I know, be written off as naive piety, high-minded fantasy. But then again, the dark pages of Jewish history have been lit by such impossibilities. And one of them, the one we are happily remembering this evening, happened in 1917. A germ of life, a great hope for the future, planted amidst the hecatombs of the dead. Thank you.
That was an amazing tour de force of detailed scholarship, deeply moving, deeply moving. We're going to do a booklet of all that's been written, we hope, for distinction about the centenary. And Simon, yours is going to be the cornerstone of that book, I have no doubt. We're incredibly grateful to you, deeply moved, and you did it wonderfully well. Thank you. Clap your hands.